Welcome, everyone. We were supposed to be joined by Gad Barzilai, who is one of the principal investigators, but he's also the deputy rector and maybe has all kinds of important duties. One word about the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law Under Extreme Conditions. This is a research center, part of the Minerva Foundation, which is an offspring of the Max Planck Foundation, establishing small research centers in Israel. We were established 5 years ago after a competitive call on the theme Life Under Extreme Conditions, and the other center that won the competition investigates how life is created in outer space. We are more minimalistic. We talk about the quality of life, not the creation of life. But we deal with the rule of law under extreme conditions, various types of extreme conditions, disasters, weather changes is one type of extreme conditions. Terrorism, belligerencies, war is another type, and we also do economic and political meltdowns. And our focus is to examine both from a normative perspective and a positive perspective, the tenets of the rule of law under extreme condition, and I will address this as a general introduction in a second. So we are about to be evaluated in the course of this year, and hope to get an extension for funding for another 6 years. So if that happens, we invite all of you to come back and visit us in the course of the coming years. I want to thank Michal and Ido for organizing this workshop. We conduct 2 young researchers workshop a year on different themes. And if you have ideas for other workshops in the course of these 2 weeks, please talk to us. As you see, the atmosphere here is informal, and I wish you all a very, very nice stay in Haifa and in Israel. I was asked to talk a little bit about Israeli counterterrorism law, and I will focus on the second half of my talk on that topic, but I want to talk a little bit before that on the general theoretical framework of the rule of law under extreme condition, and try to analyze the Israeli counterterrorism law and practice in this framework. So this is a very, very general topic, actually 2 topics. I will not be able to get into details, but since we have an hour and a half, almost an hour and a half, please feel free to intervene, ask questions. We can conduct this more as a discussion than a lecture. And I will touch various points, as I said, very, very briefly. If somebody wants to a point to be elaborated, please raise your voice. 2016 was a record year, at least since statistics are calculated, and I say a word about this as well, a record year in terror attacks and fatalities in Europe. And probably this is the reason that this topic of counterterrorism law is so popular these days. As you can see, this is a map of fatalities and terror attacks provided by history maps. About 15,000 people were killed in 2016 from terrorist attacks. But as you can see, although we talk about terrorism in Europe, the main concentration, Europe actually has a very small share of terror attacks worldwide. And as you see, the Middle East, the Gulf is the place where most terror attacks occur. 2017, by the way, 2017 according to these statistics, the number of casualties in terror attacks dropped significantly. And of course, one point for discussion later for those who are doing some empirical work, how do we actually gather information about number of terror attacks, fatalities of terror attacks? This involves a very, very complicated question of defining what is terrorism. Do we go according to the subjective definition of different countries? Do we have some objective definition of what is a terror attack? Even if we accept a common definition, then of course collecting the data is also not so simple. Many attacks are not identified, or we don't know if they are terrorist attacks or not. But in a way, I have a different statistic that was just published a few days ago in the Washington Post based on James Institute with figures, very, very different figures, much higher figures of fatalities and attacks. But the trend of 2017, which is a decrease in number of terror attacks and fatalities, is the same conclusion as the previous statistic. Here you have the number of fatalities. As you can see, 2017 here is actually a significant drop, even in comparison to the previous 5. It's the lowest record of fatalities in the last 5 years. And this raises the question, maybe counter-terrorism legislation and action is effective. Maybe, of course, this is not so easy to answer, but the general point here as an introduction is that apparently last year there was a drop in number of attacks and fatalities, and of course the problematic issues of measuring and defining terror attacks.
But it can also be affected by the way you define terror attack. If you change the definition. So
I related to this. Do we also go according to the definition of the different countries, or objective definition? As we shall see later in Barbara's presentation, when you define terrorism very broadly, you know, every political protest will be regarded as terrorism, and of course the problem of measuring and defining is a very problematic. We know that from the legal sphere, but if we look at the real world, trying to assess the trends, the world trend, it's not so easy.
The first statistic was START, or what was the other statistics other than James?
The history maps.
That's based on START.
On stars, yeah. Anyway, what I want to talk a little bit is the different responses and the different discourses about terrorism. As you can see, both if we limit ourselves to Europe, common values, common structure, common regimes, the reaction to terrorism or the treatment of terrorism is very different in two major pillars of Europe, France, and the UK. In France, the discourse is of an emergency, and as you will see, it will be important in the next stage that I will talk a little bit about the rule of law under extreme condition. The attitude is we are in emergency, we have to use emergency powers, and this is a temporary situation. Indeed, in France, following the big attack in 2016, emergency was declared. We will talk about a little bit in a second what does it entail. An emergency situation in France lasted for 2 years. It was ended just 3 months ago, but it ended with legislation of a new counter-terrorism law, which actually shifts many of the arrangements from emergency arrangement to permanent arrangement. In the UK, the discourse is different. The discourse is we have to strike a new balance between security and human rights, a normal new balance, as is reflected by the quote that you see here from David Anderson, who is the counter-terrorism advisor to the British Parliament. And indeed, in the last 3 or 4 years, 5 years in Britain, there are numerous new pieces of legislation permanent pieces of legislation, regular pieces of legislations, with various aspects of counterterrorism, which really change normality or change the rule of law in a significant way, but permanently, not as an extreme emergency constitution. So what I want to do in this talk, in the first part, is to talk a little bit about counterterrorism or terrorism in the framework of the rule of law, to mention several theories which are both normative theories, prescription, how do we have to deal with emergencies or extreme conditions or terrorism in the context of the rule of law, as well as practiced models. And we can talk a little bit about whether terrorism is an extreme condition, when or where or if terrorism is extreme condition. And following that little general introduction, I will talk again very generally about Israeli counterterrorism law and practice. When we want to talk about the rule of law under extreme condition and what happens to the rule of law under extreme condition, we have to say a word about the rule of law in normal times, or the ideal of the rule of law in normal times, and why we focus on the rule of law, why Minerva Center took the rule of law as its main project. Most of us are lawyers, and this is natural, but the rule of law actually was found to be, first of all, it's one of the very important foundations of liberal democracy. From a political philosophy point of view, from a normative legal theory point of view, the rule of law is one of the fundamental arms of liberal democracy, maybe even more important than holding general elections. This is on the theoretical side. On the practical side, the rule of law was found to be the best predictor of society or polity or country's success, not only in terms of economic success, and for economic success we have already the explanation of Friedrich Hayek showing why even dictators would have an interest to maintain some facets of the rule of law, because it brings them investments and economic success. But also in terms of other factors, other indicators of society's success, like people's well-being, reported well-being, utility, happiness. There is a correlation between the degree or the level or the quality of the rule of law and all these indicators. So the rule of law is actually a very, very important feature of modern governance. If you ask me what was the big mistakes of the Americans trying to democratize the world, right? When they tried to construct democracy in the Middle East, in Iraq, the big mistake was to think that democracy is holding elections, general elections, popular will. If you want to achieve a liberal democracy, and this is reflected both by theory and practice, institutions that will safeguard the rule of law, like independent judiciary, like independent prosecution and legal enforcement institute, are much, much more important, crucial than holding elections. You can't really have democracy based on popular will elections without those very, very fundamental institutions. That's the significance of the rule of law, and this is the reason that we try to focus on the rule of law. The rule of law is relatively a modern concept that dates back to the 16th century, basically, and it was first defined very sharply by the very famous English constitution scholar Dicey in 1889, and his definition is interesting because it's very, very actual, it's very relevant, and no one can be punished or made to suffer except for a breach of law proved in an ordinary court. This, of course, negates the idea of special tribunals, courts, military courts, and stuff like that. No one is above the law, and everyone should be equal before the law. This is basically the political idea or political philosophical idea of modern democracy. And the rule of law includes also courts or judicial decision making, and this is also important because, as we'll see in the case of Israel, the role of courts in interpreting, enforcing counter-terrorism law and other measures is very, very crucial. Okay? If we look a little bit more analytically on a modern definition of the rule of law, one can say that the rule of law comprises two main arms. One is that each member of the polity is equal before the law, and the law applies to everyone. This is the basic idea of modern democratic political philosophy since the 18th century Enlightenment. Before that, we had the concept of divine power that was above the law, and we have some remnants for that in the prerogative powers, both in the UK and in the United States. I will relate to that in a second when I talk about rule of law under extreme condition. But this was the main political revolution of the 18th century, saying everybody is subjected to the law and the law should be applied equally to everyone. And the second arm of the rule of law is that governing collective action should be by general norms and not by case to case. We can talk about these two tenets philosophically and practically quite a lot, but I will not delve into this. But governing according to general norms is also something that is under some kind of debate or risk or is threatened in extreme conditions when you have to take decisions which do not conform to general norms that you prepare in advance. So the rule of law doesn't require, by the way, democracy or elections. It is two separate things, and we can find some example, very few examples in the world of countries which do not practice democracy in the sense of general election, but have a very strong rule of law regime. For example, Singapore is an obvious case. One can distinguish within the rule of law between the formal facet of the rule of law and the substantive facet of the rule of law. The formal facet says that for individuals, every individual is free to engage in every activity that he or she is interested, save those activities that were explicitly prohibited by law. And on the other hand, any state power, and one can extend it to any unnatural legal entities like corporation, have power to do things only if explicitly they were granted this power by law. And if you combine these two maxims, a formal facet of the rule of law, you can reach the conclusion that the law actually is not silent. The law actually has to say something about any human activity, if it's legal or illegal. We have a famous maxim of the former president of the Israeli Supreme Court that everything, the law can actually relate to every human action, which brought very, very a big criticism against him as an activist and legal imperialist. But when one understands where does it stems from, this is a very, very straightforward deduction from the formal facet of the rule of law. Okay? Every person is entitled to do everything save what is prohibited on him explicitly by law, and every non-natural person, including state institutions, are entitled, or they have powers to act only when they were granted these powers specifically. Now, to materialize this formal facet of the rule of law, you have to have a good enforcement institutions. As I said, the fact that person that violated the law will be brought to trial or to justice equally, and that courts will find who violated the law, both individuals and authorities. You have to have them independent courts, not dependent on the government and not dependent on popular will. But if we stay with this formal facet of the rule of law, basically one can have draconic powers granted to state authorities and huge limitations on individual freedoms. All this in conformity with the formal facet of the rule of law, and therefore we have another layer of the rule of law, which is the substantive facet of the rule of law, which means that we have also to examine some limitations, or we have to examine whether the limitations on individual freedoms are within substantive, correct or justified criteria. And we have to examine whether giving powers to state authorities, especially the government, is also not violating several substantive elements like individual rights, human rights, like separation of powers, like decision-making, which is not reflecting raw majorities, but reflects more consensual decision-making, that will not be reflecting tyranny of the majority. And the substantive facet of the rule of law, which emerged basically after the Second World War, is a much more complicated concept, which requires some kind of a constitutional court. In civil law countries, this is a special institutions. In more continental Europe, you have a constitutional court, which is semi-political, semi-legal institutions. In the common law world tradition, Israel included in that, the enforcement of the substantive part of the rule of law is in the hand of the general court system, like in the UK, in the United States, and in other common law countries. So this is a very basic description of the rule of law. And as I said, the rule of law is the most important indicator. Again, practical or empirical findings. There are various indexes of the rule of law, the level of the rule of law, as you can see. And again, problem is how do you measure, how you define. All these definitions are you can play with. But I bring you two indexes, one of the World Justice Project, one quite veteran agency that ranks the rule of law. It's not all countries, Israel is not including in this survey, but as you can see, the Scandinavian countries fare at the top of this table. We have another index of the World Bank index. Here, as you can see, Israel is ranked as number 30, I think, worldwide. This includes all countries of the world, but basically the countries that are in the first places are very similar to the previous index that I showed. Scandinavia, New Zealand, Australia, and it's not very surprising to us that those are the countries that have the best rule of law quality. So this is the rule of law in normal times, and the challenge of the rule of law is under extreme conditions. Of course, the question is very relevant because in the last 15 years, since the September, more than 15 years, since September 11 attacks of the World Trade Center, many countries enacted various legislation, both emergency legislation and regular legislation, which violates some tenets, especially of the substantive tenets of the facet of the rule of law. And this resort to criticism that we had, thanks already in the first half of the century, for example, by Carl Schmitt, about the question, who is the sovereign and whether democracy is only a mock, because if there is some kind of power of the government, the executive, the leader, to switch the rule of law off in times of exceptions or type of emergency, then the sovereignty is not with the people, but with the person or the body that can actually switch down the normal tenets of the rule of law. Extreme conditions, as I said in the beginning, we have various types of extreme conditions: national security, terror, belligerencies, wars, and stuff like that, disasters, man-made and natural disaster, economic meltdown, political meltdown. And of course, there is a philosophical question: what constitute extreme condition in any of these categories? Okay, whether 15 years old Palestinian who runs with a knife and stabs people in the street, this is a terror attack. I will relate to it, and I think that there will be no problem in defining this if the motivation is ideological, political, to define this as a terror attack. This is a minor terror attack that doesn't really constitute extreme conditions. We don't have to have any special legal tools to face such an attack, if it's an individual attack. If 100,000 people going with knives in the street and stabbing people, this might constitute extreme condition. So where do we draw the line? In Boston, there was a terror attack a few years ago in the Marathon of Boston, which was a little bomb that was, I'm not undermining, of course, but there was a small bomb in a trash bin, which caused, I think, 2 fatalities and several people wounded. The whole Boston area was under curfew. People were not allowed to leave home for 3.5 days. Okay?
Advisory.
Sorry?
An advisory.
No, not an advisory.
It wasn't a decree of the...
There was a decree of the governor to impose curfew, and people were arrested if they left home. And anyway, the question is whether this justifies such a draconic measure.
And it is just, I would like to understand the first one, which I see it, maybe it needs, as I think, a special elaboration than the others. In which content do you refer to the attacks, or do you refer to the conflict? Because terrorism usually have a context. The context is a conflict.
Yeah.
And the conflict has its own dynamicity. So do you refer only to the attacks within a conflict, or you refer to the whole concept of terrorism, of the conflict, which we will discuss later as a low-intensity conflict? Because disasters and economic meltdown and political meltdown, they all have the characteristics and properties of crisis. You can see them as a pre-crisis, the maturation of crisis, and so on. While the attack, is it about the attacks and how you act, or is it about the whole conflict, which in some countries like us is the normal situation?
Well, I beg to differ, because in every category there are problems. Okay, if you have a flood, okay, in your home, it's a personal emergency. It's not emergency from a legal perspective, from a rule of law perspective. If the floods affect the whole town, it might still be, extreme conditions, but local extreme conditions, which doesn't justify any change of the rule of law. If the floods affect the whole country and they are long and very severe, that might require extra legal or very. So where do you draw the line is exactly the same question with terrorism. Of course, political crisis. Okay? When political crisis is a crisis that justifies a switch or a change in the rule of law is something that we can debate about. So any of these categories. And of course, you refer to the issue that a definition of extreme condition can also change from place to place according to the basic level of threat. Okay, in Europe, in many places which are accustomed to floods, the same kind of flooding will not constitute extreme condition that it will constitute in Israel.
Yes,
okay?
yes, exactly. Yes.
Terrorism in Israel is a phenomenon that exists for the last 100 years. Okay, we live with terrorism and we try to live normal life with terrorism. So the threshold of extreme conditions will be different in Israel than in many places in Europe. So there is a question of normality, which is different from one place to another.
Yes.
And this, of course, makes the definition and the justification for a very extraordinary measures much more problematic.
And also there is the subject and object of the law, which if you take lunars, as you pointed out, and they can take a terrorist organization, going from a terrorist organization to a semi-military organization, okay? So that's a very crucial dynamicity. From an evasive, elusive terrorist organization to a very geographical, defined, sometimes a semi-state or semi, okay, so this is also the subject of law. So.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Another point, I think one also has to consider as a similarity between all these, that the threat of can also exist in these other categories, not only in security terms.
Right.
You can say, okay, there's a threat of flooding, extreme flooding or tsunami or whatever, and it may be justified, or extreme measures may be justified by the threat of disaster, the same as threat of security.
Yes.
So whether something has happened or not may not be the decisive.
Right. We have, I think, what is this decisive measure from the perspective of the rule of law is the predictability and imminency. Okay. If we know that there is a global warming, and global warming can cause really disasters in a very, very big scale. But this global warming is not affecting us tomorrow. It will affect us in 10 or 20 years or 30 years or 100 years. There is no justification for a switch in the rule of law because it's not so urgent. It's urgent, but not from 1 minute to another. Okay? So the scale of a disaster caused from global warming is a huge scale, but it's not imminent, and therefore there is no justification for a departure from the regular rule of law. We can do within the regular rule of law all the necessary step, i.e. to talk about it, to deliberate what is the legislation, what is the arrangement that we want to. So all the benefits of liberal democracy, of decision-making in a liberal democracy can be maintained without justification for extraordinary measures.
It's true for climate change, but it's different with, for instance, short-term. For instance, now the city of Kapstadt has just decided that it will take extraordinary measures if people are using more water than is allowed. So, okay, you can say that they have an ordinance now, but police has given extraordinary powers to stop people from using more than 25 liters of water per day.
But this also relates, I will talk about it in a second too, the political economy problem. Okay, a good polity will prepare for various eventualities within the regular rule of law. Okay, it will have a drawer plans as well as drawer laws and regulations to deal with various eventualities like severe drought. Okay. A bad polity will not prepare, and then it will get to a crisis much faster or before the good polity. Now, what is the political economy problem? That politicians, even in democracy, don't have incentives basically to prepare. Because, earthquake, we talk about earthquake in Israel happening, one big earthquake, 1 in 100 years. The government, politician will say, it's not under my duty. Why should I invest huge amounts of money for preparation for earthquake, which will be very unpopular, the fruits of which will be, bore only in many years' time after my term of office. So there is a failure, democratic failure of preparedness, which justifies a constitutional duty on the government to prepare. A good polity, and this is what we ask sometimes, what kind of norms justifiably or should be in a constitution, and what kind of norms should be in regular legislation. And one of the things that constitution has to entail is duties on the government to prepare for various kinds of emergency. There is a new draft law in Israel. This is not the topic of this workshop, but it's quite interesting. A draft law, emergency law, which actually obliges the government to have one annual meeting to discuss all possible threats and to prescribe strategy to meet those plans without, having such a duty on the executive. One would expect that many politicians will evade these questions because they don't bring them any political benefits. So just to conceptualize the extreme conditions, what I will argue later is that we can divide basically irregular condition to three categories. Some of them are within normality. We don't have to have any special legislation or any special norms to deal with them, because the regular norms are meant to deal with extraordinary situations. The police has some powers to enter private places if a fire occurs there or if theft occurs there. You don't have to have extraordinary powers, and so forth, so on. Some situations in all these categories can be regarded as emergency, but pre-prepared emergency. We have already drawer plans, laws, contingencies, how to deal with them. And we have also the exception, the real extreme conditions, which basically are unpredictable and so imminent that you cannot really use the regular legislative or regular legal procedure to accommodate them. As I said, magnitude, population spread, geographical reach, the predictability of the situation is all the things that are important criteria that are important to assess whether we are in extreme condition. As I said, even terrorism, if we go back to our topic, terrorism, not every act of terror is an extreme condition. Certainly, most of terror attacks, very few terror attacks are exceptional in the sense that they really threat the life of or the existence of a polity. And this is, by the way, somebody thought you were researching derogations, yeah. Right? So if we look at the European Court of Justice definition for justified derogation, okay, when the whole life of population is threatened, okay, and we apply it to different kind of terror attacks. As I said, not every terror attacks justifies this. By the way, this is a very harsh definition. And actually, if one, I will not get into this, but just make a remark that this definition itself, I don't think is enforced by the European Court of Justice. Because if we look at, for example, not Turkey, but the UK, derogating from its human rights commitment in light of terror attacks, threats, none of these terror attacks or threats, even the huge attacks in the London Underground and so forth, were not threatening the existence of the UK. as a UK. Okay, so even the self-enforcement of the definition by the European Court of Justice is a little bit problematic, but it gives you a sense of what are extreme conditions from a legal perspective. Okay. Okay, I will skip that. What extreme conditions vis-a-vis the ideal or the normal rule of law means? It means that if we have an extreme condition that was not envisaged, not predictable, and is on a very large scale, we might have to compromise one of the tenets of the rule of law governing bylaws. We don't have a regular norm that can regulate, that can solve, that can bring us back to normality. And we have to decide case by case. Okay? We might have to compromise the prospective effect of laws. Laws are law. To be a legitimate democratic law should be enacted, publicized to the public, take effect prospectively and not retroactively, and so forth. These things might be compromised under extreme condition. Although for equality before the law should not be compromised. Okay? So if we resort to this formal and substantive facet of the rule of law, under extreme condition, there might be a justification to have more limitation, more restrictions on individual actions, granting more powers to the government. And on the substantive level, it might be justified to have less review of government actions, more deference to the government, easing some of the regular constitutional tests like proportionality and other tests, and I will relate to that in a second, but this is from kind of a very general observation. What might happen to the rule of law under such extreme conditions? Okay. Very briefly, we have basically three basic models, both advocated in the literature, normative models, as well as practice models in different countries relating to the rule of law under extreme condition. One model is business as usual, okay? Negating the whole idea that there should be or there is a justification for departure from the regular rule of law under extreme condition. And there are various subgroups of this business as usual model. Accommodation by legislation is one of these business as usual models. And this thought and practice believes that we can prepare everything in advance and we shouldn't have any change in procedural decision-making as well in substantive law under extreme conditions. This is one model, and as we shall see, counter-terrorism laws, like the Israeli new counter-terrorism law, basically adopts implicitly this business as usual model. Okay? A second model, which is probably the most veteran model in this context, is the emergency constitution model. Okay? This is the during model. It assumes that some conditions, some circumstances might justify a departure, a sharp departure from the rule of law. And this departure should allow us procedures for collective decision-making which are exceptional. Okay? i.e., for example, legislation by the government, by the executive, emergency regulation in Israel. Okay? Or, the classical example is the Roman model, the Roman Republic, in which if there was a threat of war, the Senate chose a dictator for 6 months. The dictator could have done whatever he thought necessary to mitigate the threat. After 6 months, he had to go home. He was not involved in regular politics. There was a clear separation between emergency and normality, and the legal order returned to its pre-emergency situation. So on one hand, this model was much better than the Weimar Republic and the modern emergency constitution because it separated personally the emergency institutions from the regular institutions. The dictator could not have any effect on after his term of 6 months. He had to go home, couldn't be involved in regular politics. On the other hand, the dictator could do everything, violating human rights without any limitation during the 6 months of his term. Out of 400 years or 450 years of Roman Republic, about 30 years were dictatorship years under these rules. But for example, declaration of emergency was not in the hand of the emergency powers. It was in the hand of the regular Senate. Okay? So there was a very interesting separation. This emergency constitution model is a model that says we have a rule of law under normal times. We have a special arrangements, rule of law under extreme conditions. What is important is to separate between the two so that emergency will not infiltrate into normality. Okay? The third model, or the third group of models, is the ex post or the stepping outside the rule of law model, which means, or which indicates that in extreme conditions, what is important is to restore normality. We disregard the rule of law in any of its facets. We can step outside the law, take all the measures that are needed in order to mitigate the situation, and legitimation and legislation will be done ex post. Okay. The prerogative model in the UK and in the US are actually stepping outside the rule of law. Okay. When you think about it, both in the US and in the UK, you have this concept that the president in the US, the government, basically the Queen, but the Queen represented by government in the UK, has prerogative power which are not enshrined in any law, and they can be used in extreme conditions. And this is basically operating outside the rule of law. And we can talk about the question, for example, whether Article 16 of the French Constitution, okay, is part of this model. This was, by the way, employed in the last 2 years. Article 16 of the French Constitution basically says that in times of emergency, the president has unlimited powers to do whatever he thinks fits doing in order to return to normality. He doesn't have to have the consent of, he has to have consultation with some bodies, including the Constitutional Court, the Constitut-État, but basically he has unlimited powers. And this can be characterized as stepping outside the rule of law. We can philosophize, about that because it's prescribed in the Constitution. But the Constitution grants basically unlimited powers to the president in such conditions. Of course, By the way, also in international law, we have these three models. Okay? The laws of war are part of the business as usual. The derogations regime is part of the emergency constitution. And we have practice in the international arena of stepping outside the rule of law, both the intervention in ex-Yugoslavia and the intervention in Iraq were basically illegal from international law point of view. They were coalition building of countries that bypassed the Security Council because the Security Council had this constant veto of some of its members negating any intervention, both in Yugoslavia, ex-Yugoslavia, and Iraq. So each of these models have advantages and disadvantages. Of course, the business as usual model, the main two disadvantages of the business as usual is, first of all, that it doesn't conform to reality. Every polity, every country in one of its historical points had to resort or depart from the regular rule of law and take extraordinary measure. And of course, we cannot predict every threat. We cannot prepare for every threat. So the idea that we can be business as usual is the solution for every sort of exceptional situation is problematic. Okay? And then comes the other big disadvantage of business as usual, as we shall see. This is the main, I think, point with regard to counter-terrorism, that if you use the business as usual model, you actually change normality for good. Okay? The new counter-terrorism laws from the American Patriot Act, okay? And I want to remind you, the American Patriot Act is one of the most human right violation legal pieces in all democracies, one of the bold violation of various human rights. It was enacted, it's a huge act giving extensive, very, very extensive authorities, powers to the government. It was enacted less than 6 weeks after September 11 as a temporary legislation with a sunset clause that was supposed to expire after a few months. It was extended and then extended again, and now it became permanent with very minor changes. So accommodation by legislation or business as usual, the main danger is that it will contaminate normality forever. Okay? UK is the same situation. Okay? You have, especially by the way, in the last 5 or 6 years, huge waves of legislation, counter-terrorism legislation, which are permanent legislation, which give extraordinary authorities, powers to the government to designate people, to strip people of all their, many of their rights, to actually deport people, various things that I will relate to in a second, in the second part, because they are also the source of Israeli legislation. As you know, we were ruled by the Brits for 40 years, and many of our emergency attitudes are inherited from the British. This is the problem with business as usual. The main problem with the emergency constitution model is that, of course, if you have very, very extensive powers in emergency, the switch, who control the switch? This is the Schmittian criticism. The person or the body that controls the switch has immense power, and it can be, of course, manipulated or used for wrong reasons. And of course, the German Weimar Republic example, which by emergency actually allowed the Nazis to come to power. The power to declare emergency was in the hands of the president, and he was pressed to declare emergency, is maybe the main lesson of the 20th century of the dangers in emergency constitution. That's the reason that Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, after the war had a very, very minimalistic emergency constitution which was enacted only in 68. It was not originally in the Gun Gazette. It was enacted only in 68. It was one of the big debates about, and still it's a very minimal emergency constitution. Stepping outside the rule of law is, of course, problematic for other reasons. It cannot operate in non-democracies, because if you step outside the rule of law and there is no mechanism that will bring you to accountability afterwards, the whole idea of legitimation and legalization post emergency doesn't exist. But it also can be misused by democracies. And as we can see from established democracies around the US and others, which uses the stepping outside the rule of law, Guantanamo Bay and others, examples, the government that misuses powers is not punished, is not brought to accountability. And this, of course, has a danger of contaminating the rule of law in normal times too. So, just to end this part, I would say that conceptually, I said it before, we can actually distinguish between three, from a normative perspective, three situations: normal times, times of emergency where we know that they will exist and we can prepare in advance, and the real times of exception when something happens that is not envisaged, not predictable, and requires really a very urgent response. And this is the real exception or the real emergency. Let me talk a little bit about Israeli counterterrorism law in this perspective. And I think it's interesting to talk about Israel as an example, because terrorism in Israel is something that we live with in the last 100 years. Basically, terrorism in Israel is almost solely on the background of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Began in the 1920s with murder of more than 100 Jews in Hebron and the elimination of the Jewish presence there, which prompted the establishment of a Jewish underground called Etzel, which prompted the British who ruled Palestine to enact, I will relate to it in a second, the defense emergency regulation, which are still in force today, which in 1948, after the establishment of the State of Israel, we had terrorist incident of assassination of the UN envoy by another extremist Jewish group, which prompted the Prevention of Terrorism Ordinance, which is the second major legal tool, anti-terrorism tool, that was enacted in a few days after basically the assassination of Count Bernadotte, who was the UN envoy. And from 1964, with the establishment of the PLO and its very well organized terrorist activities, and the 1967 occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, we have infrastructure of terror organization by the Palestinian side. We have also in the 80s various Jewish groups that resorted to terrorist activities or planned terrorist activities, including bombing or exploding the Temple Mount, the Sharam al-Kharif. And terrorism changes forms in the historical life of Israel after the Israeli towns is a new form of terrorism. And from 1915, 1916, we have this individual stabbing phenomena, or also car running and hitting population as a new form of individual terrorism, which is not all of it is actually in the form of organized and premeditated and in the form of terror organization. I relate to this because this organization element is quite important. And so, in a sense, Israel is an important example because terrorism is a phenomenon that escorts us from the very beginning of Jewish settlements in Palestine and from the beginning of the state of Israel. And in a sense, somebody said Israel is like a canary in the mine. You know, when you have a canary that threatens of less of oxygen, things that we see today in Europe, the form of terrorism and also the cause of terrorism, is something that we live with for many years. So I think the Israeli experience is quite interesting in this regard. Okay. One can say that Israel's main feature, and this is quite interesting, with all this wave of new legislation in many other Western democracies, from the Patriot Act in 2001 through the very, very extensive counterterrorism legislation of the last 2 or 3 years. Okay? The Israeli legal scene was very, very quiet or silent until 2 years ago. There were virtually no new legislation. Israel relied, I will talk about it, it's very, very extensive power, but it relied on British legislation that we inherited when the state was established, and on the terror ordinance that was enacted in 1948. And this terror ordinance is in effect only when emergency is declared. Okay. So these were the old tools of counterterrorism legislation. Very little was added to them, save financial issues, which I will also address very briefly in a second. But this changed last year with the new counterterror 2016. A new counterterrorism law took effect from November 1st, 2016. And this new counterterrorism law, which I will address in a second, is a permanent piece of legislation. So we are in a good company that shifts counterterrorism measures, laws from emergency to normality. Okay? Because the ordinance, the counterterrorism ordinance, was in effect only under emergency declaration. The new counterterrorism law, which is more balanced, but still has very draconic powers, is in effect permanently. Okay? This is one feature of the Israeli legal scene. And the second feature, I think the most important feature, is that the law in action, and this is different from many other countries, is the law in action is characterized by a very, very instrumental intervention by the courts. Okay? Unlike the American jurisprudence, which says in times of emergency, we don't review. This goes back to the Karamazov case in the Second World War, where all the Japanese or people of Japanese origins were interned. And this was challenged in court as unconstitutional. The court said, emergency, we are not intervening. And this continued also in the last round. For many years, the American Supreme the court did not intervene in the Guantanamo situation, which was basically illegal. Almost for 10 years it didn't intervene. So this is the state of mind of the American jurisprudence. In time of emergency, we don't intervene. The same goes to many other countries, UK, France, other countries. The Israeli case is very different. The court intervenes, and I will say a few words on this. The court has a very, very important role in the actual materialization of counterterrorism law, and in a sense it balances the very, very draconic power that are granted to the authorities by law. And one of the things that characterize the Israeli landscape is that we have a very, very independent, so far, very independent judiciary, a very activist judiciary, probably very liberal orientated judiciary in comparison to the other branches of government, unlike the American courts, which sometimes are much more conservative. The government in Israel, always the judiciary has been much more lefty or liberal than the other arms of government. And when one assesses counterterrorism law, it cannot be done without taking into account the court's input. What is very dangerous at the moment is that our very extreme right-wing government is trying also to affect the independence of the courts through changing their way of judicial appointments and other things. And this is the most crucial, probably, problem from a legal perspective of this current government, that if they will succeed, like the Polish did, or other countries, in ruining the independence of the judiciary, then the main safeguard against violation of human rights and other, and balancing the very draconic powers will be eliminated. Israel has the third characteristic of the Israeli counterterrorism law is that Israel uses emergency constitution model as well as business as usual model, but to the credit of the Israeli regime, there is no stepping outside the rule of law. Okay? Everything is within the rule. There is one or two examples in Israel history that there was some kind of stepping outside the rule of law, but basically, unlike many other liberal democracies, we don't see the stepping outside the rule of law model not as a preferred model, nobody advocates it, and not basically not practice model as well. Okay? So our emergency constitution, again, on the books, it's very, very nice. In practice, is less nice. The emergency constitution dates back to 48, and it's now entrenched by basic law of the government. As you know, we don't have a written constitution. We are one of the 3 world countries.
In God we trust.
Hmm?
In God we trust.
Yeah, not really. in Bibi we
that
trust.
That is why.
UK, New Zealand, and Israel are the countries that don't have a written formal constitution, although Britain now has the Human Rights Act, and New Zealand has some kind of form of... we have basic laws, which the court gave. The court gave the basic laws, basically the